Good morning and welcome to our session on REMS assessments. My name is Doris Auth and I'll be speaking for the first half of this session before turning it over to my colleague, Shelly Harris. The learning objectives of this session are to understand the requirements for REMS assessments, to recognize the importance of planning for REMS assessments during the development of the REMS, to describe considerations for developing methodology for REMS assessment knowledge surveys, and to describe best practices for conducting these surveys and REMS assessments. The content on the next 3 slides was covered at the session yesterday by Cynthia Lasavita and Jackie Shepard. However, I would like to briefly review this content as a reminder and in the event that someone missed the session. Our risk evaluation and mitigation strategy is a risk management plan that goes above and beyond routine labeling and is intended to achieve specific goals and objectives to mitigate the risk or risks of a particular drug. REMS are essentially required to ensure that the benefit of the drug outweighs its risk. A REMS can include a medication guide or patient package insert, communication plans for healthcare providers. Also, packaging and safe disposal technologies may be required for drugs associated with abuse or overdose. Elements to assure safe use, which I'll review again on the next slide, as well as an implementation system. And all REMS must include a timetable for the assessment submissions. Once again, the elements to assure safe use are interventions or actions that healthcare providers must take in order to prescribe or dispense the drug. And some of these actions may also be required in order for the patient to remain on the drug. These 6 requirements, or elements to assure safe use, are not mutually exclusive. And most REMS employ a combination of them, including the requirement that prescribers have specific training or certification to prescribe, the requirement that pharmacists and other dispensers have certification to dispense, also limitation of dispensing to certain healthcare settings, for example, infusion centers or hospitals, dispensing of the drug after verification of certain safe use conditions, such as laboratory tests, may also be required, as well as the requirement that patients using the drug are subject to monitoring. And finally, some REMS require that each patient using the drug be enrolled in a registry. Similar to other public health initiatives, REMS are a continual process of development, approval, implementation, evaluation, and modification. In some situations, we have eliminated entire REMS. Let's move on to the requirements for REMS assessments. First, the frequency. The statute states the timetable for REMS assessments for NDAs and BLAs must be at a minimum of 18 months, 3 years, and in the 7th year after the strategy is initially approved, and at a frequency specified in the REMS. The timetable can be either increased or reduced in frequency and eliminated in some circumstances. I would like to point out that for REMS with elements to assure safe use, we typically require assessments on at least an annual basis following REMS approval. Next, the statute doesn't provide a lot of details on the content of the REMS assessments. The statute states only that the assessment shall include, with respect to each goal in the REMS, an assessment of the extent to which the strategy or the REMS, including each element, is meeting the goal, or whether one or more goals or elements should be modified. The FDA has issued 2 draft guidances for REMS assessments. Those are in the yellow puzzle piece. The first of these that I'll be discussing is the REMS assessment planning and reporting guidance for industry. Issuance of a guidance on REMS assessments was actually a commitment under the 5th Prescription Drug User Fee Act in 2013. PDUFA 5 specifically stated that a guidance be developed that focuses on methodologies for determining whether REMS with the TASU is commensurate with the specific risks in the labeling, and considering that risk is not unduly burdensome on patient access to the drug. This next slide is just a snapshot of the outline from the guidance. The guidance describes the development of a REMS assessment plan, which I'll discuss further in a minute, and how the REMS goals, objectives, requirements, and design impacts the selection of metrics and data sources necessary to assess whether the program is meeting its goals. It also discusses considerations for assessing the impact of the REMS on healthcare delivery system burden and patient access. And finally, it provides recommendations on a standardized approach for reporting the assessment findings to the FDA in the REMS assessment report. I'll describe the key messages from certain sections of the guidance, beginning with the overview section, which introduces the importance of development of clear risk minimization goals and objectives, which in turn will drive the requirements of the REMS, the implementation, and the materials necessary to support the REMS. The overview also touches a bit on some REMS design considerations important for the development of the REMS assessment, which include consideration of the characteristics of the risk, including any risk factors if known, as well as any timing and reversibility of the risk if known. Also, any available evidence that the proposed strategy is effective, for example, experience with REMS for similar risks. The identification of potential stakeholders and the feasibility of implementing the REMS on these stakeholders. So for example, the strategy that may be necessary to mitigate the risk of a drug used primarily by specialists familiar with management of a specific risk is likely different than the strategy necessary if those same specialists were very familiar with the management of the risk. And finally, the design should consider potential burden to the healthcare delivery system and impact on patient access to the drug. I'd like to point out a few things about the REMS assessment plan. First, the REMS assessment plan describes how the applicant intends to assess the performance of the REMS and determine whether it's meeting its goals and objectives. There are two areas where the assessment plan may be found. First, it can be found in the approval letter, which is publicly available from drugs at FDA. The approval letter in general includes a broad outline of the assessment categories and metrics. The assessment plan can also be found in the REMS supporting document, which unfortunately is not publicly available. In this document, the applicant not only outlines the categories and assessment metrics, but also includes a description and rationale for each data source that will be used, as well as providing timelines for any submissions of methodologies for FDA review. The REMS assessment overview also encourages the use of multiple data sources, multiple metrics, and multiple methodologies, which may include data collected from the applicant's REMS database, from knowledge surveys, drug utilization data, post-marketing adverse event data, as well as observational or epidemiology studies, and root cause analyses. The REMS assessment plan should describe challenges and limitations of each data source or methodology. And the guidance also encourages novel methods of evaluating REMS. In the assessment plan development section, the draft guidance stresses the need for including both process indicators as well as outcome indicators in the evaluation of the REMS. Process indicators evaluate the extent of compliance with the REMS processes, such as whether all prescribers are completing monthly monitoring, while outcome indicators evaluate the safety-related outcome of interest if possible. For example, for a REMS intended to prevent pregnancy, how many pregnancy exposures were avoided by the REMS requirement for obtaining pre-treatment pregnancy tests. The sources of data and methodological approaches should also be described, and thresholds for effectiveness, along with the rationale for how these thresholds were determined, should be included in the plan. Finally, the guidance provides standard assessment categories and examples of metrics for each of these. The guidance provides 5 general categories for grouping assessment metrics, although there can be some metrics that may fit into more than one category. These categories include outreach and communication. For example, how many REMS letters were sent to prescribers or other healthcare providers. REMS implementation and operations, such as the number of patients, prescribers, and pharmacies enrolled in the REMS, as well as any difficulties that the stakeholders may have in enrolling. Information on compliance with safe use behaviors, such as completion of laboratory or other monitoring. And health outcomes, or surrogates of health outcomes, such as the number and outcomes of adverse events that occurred. Finally, evaluation of patient, healthcare provider, and pharmacist knowledge of the risk and REMS requirements. Since the draft REMS was released, we've been revising REMS assessment plans to align with these categories. The guidance also includes a section on the evaluation of the impact of REMS on the healthcare delivery system, burden, and patient access that encourages the early identification of potential burdens or potential barriers to patient access that may be created by the REMS, along with a description of how the REMS was designed to minimize the burden and any potential barriers to patient access, and a plan for evaluation of burden and access in the REMS assessments. The REMS assessment guidance provides an outline for the format of the assessment report that, in addition to the results or findings from each assessment metric, includes a discussion section that should provide a thoughtful overall assessment that pulls together all of the data and methodologies for a determination of whether the REMS goals are being met. The assessment report should also include any proposed modifications to the REMS or revisions to the assessment plan resulting from the REMS assessment report findings. Thank you. I will now turn the presentation over to Shelly Harris.
Hi, my name is Shelly Harris and I'm the REMS assessment team leader in the Division of Risk Management. Today, I will be giving an overview of the draft guidance for REMS assessment survey methodologies. The draft guidance was published in January 2019. The guidance discusses general principles and recommendations related to conducting REMS assessment knowledge surveys, including study design, instrument development, data collection, and analysis. This provides a general outline of the guidance and highlights areas I will discuss today. I will begin with some background about the guidance, discuss general components included in the guidance, and end with next steps. Most REMS include a goal to inform or educate healthcare providers and/or patients about the risk associated with a drug or how to safely use a drug. When this goal is included, the assessment plans usually require a knowledge evaluation. To evaluate this goal, applicants most often use surveys to assess patient and healthcare provider understanding. On June 7, 2012, FDA held a public workshop called REMS Assessments, Social Science Methodologies to Assess Goals Related to Knowledge. Input received from the workshop and docket comments were incorporated into this guidance. Endpoints of interest are measurements of knowledge of the REMS key messages in a target population of interest. The knowledge rate is the proportion of respondents who know the key message out of all respondents. Survey methodologies should clearly define the REMS key messages and how each endpoint will be calculated from the survey items. Examples of endpoints of interest can include the proportion of prescribers who know about the serious risks and the proportion of prescribers who know the patient monitoring requirements. Applicants should propose a performance threshold. This threshold is the minimum knowledge rate that, if achieved, indicates the REMS met the goal of communicating the REMS key messages. If the knowledge rates are below the pre-specified thresholds, the applicant should propose steps to reach the desired threshold. The threshold should be determined on a case-by-case basis, but it is generally acceptable to be set at 80% or higher for each key message. The applicants should provide justification for the threshold that is informed by the public health implication of a lack of knowledge of the REMS key messages. This may depend on the indication, the severity and prevalence of the safety concerns, and the target population. Sampling of the target population is more feasible since it is rarely possible to survey the entire target population. Examples of sampling frames vary by the REMS requirements. If a REMS includes mandatory patient, prescriber, or pharmacy enrollment, these databases can be used as a sampling frame. If the REMS doesn't include these mandatory databases, example frames can include lists from chain pharmacies or voluntary patient registries. To sample from the selected frame, we recommend using a probability random sample. If this is not feasible, then the applicant should discuss other types of surveys with the FDA. We also recommend using a multimodal approach to recruit participants, such as mail, email, and phone. The applicant should provide strategies to minimize non-response, such as social validation or follow-up using different modes than initial contacts. Sample size is the number of survey participants in a population of interest. The number of subjects invited to participate in a survey should be larger than the target sample size to account for non-response. Sample size calculations can depend on the following: the sampling design. Some examples of probability sampling designs are simple random samples, stratified random samples, and cluster samples. The precision. We recommend the precision is controlled at 5% or less in the sample size calculation. The assumed knowledge rate, which is the best guess or expected knowledge rate. For a conservative estimate, one might use 50%, which would yield the largest sample size estimate. And the target population size, or the number of individuals in the target population. When conducting the survey, the applicant should provide inclusion and exclusion criteria for the survey participants. This criteria may vary depending on the REMS. Participants should be informed that their participation is voluntary, they can stop at any time, and that their answers will not affect their ability to prescribe, dispense, or receive the drug. Since the purpose of the survey is to assess knowledge retention, the educational material should not be provided during the survey. A sample rendition or a text description of the material can be provided to remind participants of the correct material. When developing the survey, applicants should involve experts in questionnaire design. The survey instrument should be pre-tested. A variety of question types should be used, such as open-ended, multiple choice, true-false, and false or plausible incorrect answers should be included. Questions should be framed based on the information in the REMS materials or the prescribing information or medication guide, not on the respondent's experience or opinions. The survey should also include questions that assess participants' knowledge, receipt, and source of REMS materials. Analyses and results should follow the pre-specified statistical analysis plan. The analysis should include a comparison of the characteristics of the respondents to the known characteristics of the target population. A comparison between responders and non-responders should be included. When the number of completed surveys is higher than the expected number of surveys, data from all of the surveys should be included in the analysis. Unanswered survey questions should be considered as missing instead of incorrect. The number of respondents who report each answer choice or response option should be included in the results. In terms of next steps, we are currently reviewing and addressing the docket comments and making additions or corrections as appropriate. We're also considering the addition of information on sampling small populations and methods to minimize non-response, since these are some recurring issues across REMS. Now, I will discuss some best practices and potential challenges related to REMS assessments. In terms of best practices, outcomes for successful REMS should be clearly defined before developing the REMS. The assessment metrics should map back to the goals and requirements of the REMS. The REMS design should allow for appropriate data to be collected that assess the REMS. REMS assessments should include a variety of methodologies and data sources. These methodologies should be submitted for FDA review before implementation. Justifications for the proposed study type should be provided in the protocol. Potential challenges include establishing thresholds. Pre-specifying thresholds for determining whether or not the REMS is meeting goals can be challenging, but is necessary for REMS assessments. It can be difficult to determine if outcomes are due to the REMS or due to other healthcare or public health initiatives. For a REMS that is established at drug approval, there's often no baseline data to use as a comparison to see if changes were due to the REMS. Available data sources is another challenge. Many REMS drugs are infrequently prescribed, so some data sources may not have sufficient data to study the REMS impact. Similarly, many of the REMS drugs are prescribed to small populations. The health outcomes that are the focus of the REMS may occur rarely, so it'll be challenging to accurately evaluate using available data sources. Lastly, many REMS surveys have challenges with recruitment and low response rates. The results may not be generalizable to the target population. Now for our first challenge question. Which of the following statements are true? A, REMS assessments are required only for REMS with elements to assure safe use. B, all methodologies used in REMS assessments should be submitted for FDA review. C, patients who are enrolled in REMS programs must agree to participate in REMS knowledge surveys. D, A and C only, or E, all of the above. So the correct answer is B. All methodologies used in REMS assessments should be submitted for FDA review. We'd prefer that they are submitted as REMS assessment methodologies no later than 90 days before implementation, but the earlier the better. Our second challenge question. What is an appropriate knowledge performance threshold for a REMS survey key message? A, 80% or higher. B, a threshold that is determined on a case-by-case basis that is informed by the public health implications of a lack of knowledge. C, both A and B. Or D, none of the above. The correct answer is C, both A and B. A, 80% or higher, and B, a threshold that is determined on a case-by-case basis, are both acceptable knowledge performance thresholds for a REMS survey key message. I would like to thank the collaborators for this guidance and those who helped with this presentation, including the Office of Medication Error Prevention and Risk Management, staff in the Division of Risk Management, and staff in the Division of Biometrics 7 in the Office of Biostatistics. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Auth and Dr. Harris. We really appreciate your presentation. They're so helpful today, and it's great to kick off the morning with you. For all of our attendees, if you can go ahead and type all of your questions in the lower right pad, we're going to go ahead and take all of the questions we have time for. So it would be great if you can get yours highlighted today. And we're going to go ahead and get started. We've got a lot of questions that came in already, and they all really were having to do with REMS elimination. So I'll ask Dr. Auth to start addressing this issue right off the bat, since it sounds like there's a lot of interest. So for Dr. Auth, we're going to go ahead and ask you, are REMS or their summaries public? And I think we're going to go ahead and, since her microphone is not yet linked up, we're going to go ahead and ask Dr. Harris if you can address the elimination. So for Dr. Harris, if you're on right now, for the REMS that have been eliminated, what is the average time it generally took for a REMS to get eliminated?
And good morning, this is Jeff. Dr. Harris, we do have your microphone unmuted for you. We can hear you typing if you want to go ahead and respond. And now you're muted again.
Yeah, and actually we can go back maybe to Dr. Auth if you're ready for the questions about REMS elimination. Do you want to unmute yourself and just say hello? Dr. Auth? Can you hear me? Great. Yep, we can hear you great. All right.
Excellent. I apologize for that. I am going to go back with the first question that was posed before my microphone was unmuted, and that question was, are the REMS or their summaries public? And I think that's actually a twofold question, but the REMS, and I believe this was mentioned yesterday, the REMS are public. The REMS documents can be found at REMS at FDA. That's publicly available. So the REMS documents are found there, as well as the requirements and all of the materials. Those are all posted. The second part of that question, I believe, was referring to the REMS assessments and whether those are public. Unfortunately, those assessments are not publicly available. We have made some of them available, particularly for the opioids, and I can be sure to send around that link. So the REMS assessments that come in, or the reports that come in from the manufacturers or the shared system consortiums, generally those are not made public. They can be found, they can be gotten through a Freedom of Information Act request, or we've often discussed them publicly when we've had advisory committee meetings specifically to talk about a REMS issue. We are hoping to put some summaries of those REMS assessments up on the website at some point in the future. As you can imagine, there's a lot of hoops that we have to jump through in order to be able to do so, but we are working on that, and we have received that comment over a number of years that would be really, really helpful for the public to be able to see kind of what we're seeing from our end. Thank you.
Thank you so much for explaining that, and it makes sense to start out with that overview. So one of the questions about elimination that came in, it said, for the REMS that have been eliminated, what would you say is the average time it takes to get a REMS lifted?
That question, we actually received a whole bunch of questions about REMS elimination, and I'm going to touch on that question as well as the other questions, which were examples of any past cases where REMS was eliminated, what were the reasons and rationale for doing that, conditions surrounding the elimination and what prompted us, and then how is it, these are all very similar, how is it decided that a REMS is no longer needed. We would love to have some sort of, kind of magic formula for whenever we could eliminate a REMS, but what we've done to date has been on a very case-by-case basis. In some situations, we like to make it clear that the actual risk may not have may not go away, but the REMS has been eliminated. And an example for that would be the Tikecin REMS. That was eliminated, I believe, in 2015, perhaps 2016. And there were several points that led us to determine that we could eliminate that REMS. And one of them was that we really felt that the risk was very ingrained in clinical practice, and there were guidelines available. The other reason that we used to eliminate it was that we did have REMS assessments that showed that prescribers were well aware of the risk. Those that were involved in the program, and there were a very few that were not. And so we felt that knowledge was out there. And also there is another product that was very similar on the market with very similar risks and very similar guidelines for administration that did not have a REMS. So that was the case of Tikecin. And so for each of the instances, the rationale has been different. We also eliminated a portion of the Letairis REMS, which is now the ambrisentan REMS, the shared system REMS. And that was, the initial REMS was directed against preventing pregnancy and teratogenicity, as well as for liver damage. And so a couple of years after the REMS was approved, there was an advisory committee, and we reanalyzed the data on the liver abnormalities and determined that it was no longer necessary to have that component in the REMS. So that's an example of when a portion of a REMS was eliminated, but not the entire program. And the last example that I'll point out is for the ESA REMS. And that was eliminated primarily because it was shown that a lot of the safe use conditions that we were trying to implement in the REMS were already being managed without the REMS. And so that was another example. But I would just really like to stress that there is no one magic formula. We take each of these REMS in developing them very, very seriously, as well as whenever we feel like there's a need to eliminate. And finally, the question that kind of started this all off was when, is there an average number of years? And there is none. Again, I think the ones that we have eliminated have been in place for many years, but I don't know that there's any sort of, average time that we could, at some point we start thinking about eliminating. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Auth. That's such a great and thorough answer. We really appreciate it, and I feel like the audience, since they had so many questions, they appreciate the time you took to really walk through it. So thank you for that. Our next question is going to be for Dr. Harris. So the audience wants to know, does FDA review and consider FAIR's safety data relevant to the risks being mitigated when assessing the effectiveness of REMS programs? Or does FDA only look at data included in the REMS assessment plan in the REMS assessment process? You can just speak to that.
Hi, we use we use FAIR's data, and we use data that's included in the REMS assessment plan. So we want to look at each REMS as comprehensively as possible. So adverse event data and from FAIR's and adverse event data from the sponsor are all included when we're doing a REMS assessment.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dr. Harris. So another question to you. Can the methodologies that you discussed be applied to the assessment of burden and barriers as well?
So the methodology, the survey methodologies that I presented on are mainly to address knowledge surveys. But in terms of knowledge, some sponsors have included questions about burden or access questions in their surveys. So they choose to address access and burden that way.
Okay, great, thank you. And another question for you. What expectations does FDA have for quality assurance and auditing with respect to REMS?
So for REMS assessments, we expect sponsors to develop an audit and a non-compliance plan and implement those. And FDA goes out and does inspections to the different sponsor sites. And we would like those audit and non-compliance plans. We often ask the sponsors to submit those to us as methodology reviews as well, at least 90 days before implementation, so we can provide feedback or comments about those in order before they implement their audits.
Thank you so much. And this is the last question that we have time for, so it's going to be back to Dr. Auth. So they want to know, what is the expected timeline to receive feedback following the review of an annual REMS assessment report?
In December of 2019 that outlined what our review timelines were for reviewing a REMS assessment, and we expect to complete those assessments and communicate the findings back to the sponsors in about 6 months. We would love to be able to do that quicker, but that just happens to be, when we have a lot of data, it may take us longer. So 6 months is the timeline that we're shooting from. And if I would, do I have a minute for one more clarification?
I we have another really great question. A really great question coming in for you. So if you have time for that one, that would be great. And I'll just go ahead and read it. So the person, this great question that just came in, does the sponsor need to initiate a request for FDA to review a REMS for the possibility of elimination? And this will be our last question.
Thank you, and that allows me a chance to clarify what I stated earlier in my answer about the REMS elimination. Yes, the sponsor should be submitting the request for elimination as a REMS modification, and ideally the sponsor would have a lot of data in there to support why the REMS could be eliminated.
So much to Dr. Auth and Dr. Harris for your presentations, and again for taking time for the Q&A and